Welcome to the Tuesday night Energon Hangout. And tonight we're going to be having a discussion on determinism and is it really so? And we'll be having with Dr. Bruce Epperly and with Henry Neufeld. So let me start off by just tossing out the question that seemed to have sparked this, which is in Matthew when Jesus is betrayed. Matthew 26, it says. The Son of Man is going away just as it had been written about him. How terrible it will be for the man to whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him if he had never been born. And the question of, since this is at least portrayed as very much a predicted event, as not even though it would happen, but who will do it and what they will do. One of the questions that comes to mind is, did Judas really have a choice in this whole thing?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think the scriptures are a little ambiguous about this. If you look at the scriptures as a whole, it's clear that human beings are actors in a historical drama and not merely passive recipients. Could Judas have had a role in terms of determining what choices he made? I rather think so. Certainly, I think it makes more sense theologically if Judas makes choices in the same sense that we do. If Judas doesn't have a choice, there's no culpability on his part, nor is there any virtue on his part. And it would fall very much into the Calvinistic damned if you do, damned if you don't, that Judas is frankly no choice whatsoever, and he's going to be considered the worst person possible, even though he's chosen nothing. So I think perhaps a better way of looking at this is that Judas has some agency in the process, and he may have made the wrong decision, although if you go back to the traditional understanding of Judas' work, Judas is the one that enables the cross to occur, which enables salvation to occur. So in an odd way, Judas becomes really the positive instrument of God, if you look at it from the traditional theological viewpoint.
Henry?
Yeah, isn't that an interesting twist that we have there to the story? That first of all, the thing that is most determined, and perhaps that we should be asking the question is, was the crucifixion a determined event? Because the passage that you quoted from Matthew there, Elgin, even though I was actually, as we were starting this thing, was looking for, there's somewhere that I thought there was somewhere where they quote from one of the Psalms that that you're going to be betrayed by one of the people closest to you, that's quoted as a scripture, but I couldn't find it. I may be remembering incorrectly. But as you read that Matthew passage, the most determined statement there is made about Jesus. The Son of Man has to go as it was done. Judas enables that to happen, and of course then it is woe to Judas. Judas then is historically been considered, the definite apostle out. I think there's hardly a more negative view, of a New Testament character really than Judas. But the determination seems to be a great deal more about Jesus. So you ask the question, almost you could switch the question and say, did Jesus have a choice?
And that's a very interesting question, too. Did Pilate have a choice? Did the Jewish leaders have a choice? Were they all automatons? And I think agency either occurs or it doesn't. I think Jesus had a choice myself. I think Jesus had a choice, and the Scripture, at least one Scripture, verifies this or supports this. Jesus is in the garden, and he says, I wish this cup would pass from me. And then he acquiesces to the divine vision. He says, not my will, but thine. Many people, I think, understand the will of God as in terms of power, when I believe, if you look at the Lord's Prayer as an example, thy will be done, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as is in heaven, that's not about power. I think that John Cross and others are correct when they say, let earth resemble heaven. I think Jesus is trying to align himself with God's vision. And at that moment, which is the highest vision for his vocation, I think Jesus had options. And I think they're present in the garden, but he chose to follow his vocation to the very end.
Well, isn't that actually one of the hardest prayers that for us as individuals? I know it's one that I have personally struggled with from time to time, where I essentially pray, not my will, but thy will.
And that's really the right prayer, isn't it, Elgin?
It's the right prayer, but it's a very hard prayer at times.
Well, yeah, and part of it is that we poor mortals, I think Jesus has a qualitative difference experience than I do, but I think we poor mortals have the struggle to figure out what God's will is in a given situation too. Or as I tell my congregation, sometimes there's more than one right answer to a situation in the church. And how do we discern the best of the many good answers in our own lives? But I think that you're right on target. How do I align myself with God's vision for this moment, what De Caussade calls the sacrament of the present moment? How do I lean into God's vision and then go with it, even if it's bigger than mine?
Yeah. Well, there's another aspect to the story, because I believe it's in Luke, where it talks about how once Judas had made the decision, that Satan entered into him at that point.
Yeah.
And again, how does that line up with determination and free will?
Well, isn't that interesting? Because I would suspect that people are always entering into our experience and influencing us, but it's a very perplexing passage. I've been studying about angels and demons lately. I have a congregation that loves to ask questions, so we just started doing a theological reflection group on angels, mysteries, and miracles. And of course, you can't bring in the angels without bringing in the demons. Darn it! And so the question of the demons is a curious one. And is Satan in a pervasive influence? Is Satan a pervasive influence just like God is? It's an interesting question.
Henry, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I was going to say just to step back just a little bit first is in this matter of people of agency. I think what I hear a lot that makes a problem for people is a very binary view. You're either completely and utterly free in your decisions, or you're completely and utterly determined, when in fact there are many influences that work. In my life, as I come to a decision, there are things which are determined, and then there are things there's input which I have as to how I respond to all of that. And so it's not really entirely a yes/no, in the sense that I can take any option whatever, but even my decisions up till now, and that goes back. You were saying, Bruce, everybody, how should I say, various people enter in and influence, and of course the question again comes in responsibility. If Satan, presumably, and I don't know exactly what concept Luke is working with at this point of Satan and his powers and whatever, but if Satan, presumably a powerful being, enters into Judas, again, what options does he have? That sounds to me like he's he's on the railroad track and he can't get off.
And of course, we're never given any information about Judas' motivations. Of course, people have tried to figure out what his motivation was for betraying Jesus. As I look at Judas' life, like all the other disciples, once upon a time he encountered Jesus and his life was transformed. And what happens that turns him away? Some people say that it's disappointment in Jesus. Others say that he's trying to force Jesus' hand and really force Jesus to be the Messiah he's expecting. Some people, there are several possible options for the meaning of Iscariot, but one of them is sort of a a zealot, a revolutionary? And is he trying to force Jesus to call down all those legions of angels and clean up the city? We just simply don't know. Judas seems to have some remorse. That is, he ends up, according to one account, hanging himself, I believe. And is that some act of despair or depression or feeling that he has gone beyond the possibility of coming back to God? We just simply don't know. He's a very interesting figure.
I always thought one of the interesting aspects of that was the series. I don't think, I mean, like Henry was saying, oftentimes people present decisions as binary, and they're really not. Very few of our decisions in life are, do we have complete freedom? Maybe when we go into a restaurant and we're picking off the menu, we might have freedom, but even there we're going to be constrained by cost and calories and all sorts of other
and what the menu is.
So when you look at someone like Judas Iscariot, it's not one decision. I mean, John mentioned that he was a treasurer and that he had been stealing from the funds for a while. So it's you can see almost a whole series of decisions, mini ones, each one probably not that big of a deal, leading up to the major one where he betrays. And yes, I don't think it's that unusual for, I've seen people in my own life where you see them making a whole series of decisions and then suddenly a major event happens and then they feel remorse, but it's really, too little too late in some respects. They've already done the damage.
Yeah, and I think that's true for the nature of sin in general, which we all participate in, is a series of decisions we make over time, either for or against God's vision for us, and we all make them. We all make the less than optimal decisions, and most of the time we don't even know what they are. Most of the time I think we think sometimes we're doing the right thing and discover that we're going in exactly the wrong direction. It becomes more stark when we're dealing with, say, addictive issues where we either stay on the path or we fall off the path. I think the temptations to make the wrong decisions are more subtle for the average person.
Yeah. And does addiction really involve a choice? I mean,
that's an interesting thing, and that, of course, brings in the whole question of, use an example. As a child, I had asthma. And even as an adult who knows and has been through my own self-discovery and therapeutic journeys and all those sort of things, in certain settings, I start getting nervous and start breathing like I did when I was 2 years old, even though I exactly know why I'm doing that, because I had asthma as a child and I'm nervous about pulmonary issues. And that's there 60 years ago. And it shapes the quality of my experience quite often in certain contexts. So I think our freedom is both very important on the one hand and also quite limited on the other. In this moment, I think we have the moment of decision. I agree with Viktor Frankl that they can take away everything from a person except his or her attitude, but even that is shaped by a whole lifetime of decisions, of making right decisions that predispose us toward continued right decisions.
Yeah. Clearly, I'm not a Buddhist, but I did have a Buddhist professor once who presented a view of karma as not a series of actual literal rebirths, but a series of decisions that you make over your entire lifetime. And as each time you make a decision, you become sort of a new person as a result of that decision, and then your karma is essentially the sum total of all the decisions you've made up to that point.
I think that's probably a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
Well, we might want to take a look at the, because we were talking about Judas being determined, Jesus being determined, and I know that one of the questions we had having to deal with prophecy. Now, Elgin and I, not that long ago, were having a discussion about Daniel 9. And speaking of demons and angels, I really love the Daniel 10 thing where you have the messenger who comes to Daniel is stopped by the Prince of Persia, who is in turn put into play by Michael, the great prince, who then, of course, lets the messenger get to Daniel, and you start going, why did they do that? And that whole interesting spiritual battle going on in the background, that relates to, the topic you're talking. You get the angels, and then you have to worry about the demons.
Well, it would seem that, and of course that's a whole other subject. Maybe you'll see a book on that subject sometime again. I try to write everything I think, so that you never know what might happen. But yes, that's a whole other ball game. Did the angels have the freedom to fall? And how on earth could the angels fall to begin with if they were so close to God? That's just a very interesting other side topic.
Well, good. Bringing it back to the issue of determination. So where does, you have, of course, the classic Calvinist versus Arminius point of view, and is it really possible to have moral culpability if we don't have choice?
It certainly doesn't seem that, to me it does not seem so. I think that culpability is related to some element of freedom, some element of the ability to choose, even if there's only 3 paths, to choose one path rather than the other 2. I find the Calvinist approach really a challenging one, and it says more about God perhaps than it does about me, that God actually condemns people to be evil, and condemns them before the creation of the universe, and they have no choice in the matter whether they'll be saved or not. I think that God is present in every event, and that God's movements of providence are moving through every event, but I prefer to call it a gentle providence. That not only allows us to be culpable, but also feel some joy in achievement. To feel some joy in achievement. I don't think God begrudges our creativity.
No, I think that's one of the things that makes us what we are. That sets us apart from the animal, so to speak, is the ability to be creative, to have a Mozart or a Rembrandt or a Beethoven. It's one of those strange. One of the things that I find unique is the role of suffering that oftentimes involves creativity. Like if you look, if Russia had been a garden palace, a paradise, would we have gotten, the Brothers Karamazov or?
Oh yes, that's a good
great Russian music.
Yeah, I think you're right on target there, because there is something about the antagonistic or ambiguous elements of life that call us to become hopefully our better selves, and call us to ask questions about the world. I mean, I think some of the greatest literature, and I'd include Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the Book of Job in that category, involves dealing with powers beyond ourselves that we have to contend with. And the suffering of life can be ennobling or can it be destructive.
But isn't that a microcosm of our relationship to God?
Well, I'd suspect so. And certainly I'm studying and studying the mystics and teaching a course on mysticism at my church. And, one of the characteristics of the mystics is not only their closeness to God, but their feeling of their distance from God. And they're feeling a certain sense of bereftness, the dark night of the soul, which the rest of us who are happy with beer and Skittles don't even notice.
Yeah. Well, isn't that sort of like just knowledge in general? The more you know, the more you realize that you don't know. And so the closer we get to God, the more we actually realize how wide the gulf actually is.
The gulf is a great one. And we aspire toward greatness but seldom achieve it.
Well, maybe one of you can remember. There's who said this first, but it was the saying that as the island of my knowledge grows, so does the seashore of my ignorance.
The horizon is always receding. And that's kind of exciting, though, that the horizon is receding. When I look on a good day, if where I live out on the seashore, and so this is a real metaphor for me, Henry. I'm looking at the horizon of the seashore every day in the morning or in the afternoon when I go down to the beach, and on a clear day, you actually have a horizon receding further than you can see. And I think as we draw nearer to God, we may discover that God is much more than we can either imagine or ask, to use a play on one of Paul's comments.
So where are you, Dr. Bruce?
Cape Cod.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I'm a transplant from the Washington, D.C. and area, originally California, but Washington, D.C. and Lancaster, Pennsylvania areas originally.
Okay. I spent quite a few years in California, so.
So did I.
Great place to be from.
Including grad school at Claremont.
Oh, well, I used to live in Redlands, San Bernardino, so I was not too far away.
Yeah, I know those areas too.
I'd like to connect this knowledge thing that you've just been bringing up back to Judas, because we're talking about culpability and choice. And we also brought in prophecy, so now I'm going to get complicated and tie these things together. Really, if you read the prophecies of the Old Testament, this is my opinion, it is very hard to come up with, before the fact, something like the life of Christ. That is to say, the life and the death, because there were many messianic ideas, but none of them included what we have in Christian theology, Christian eschatology, which is a division between a first and a second advent. So here's Judas. He has the scriptures. He believes that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the anointed one. Now I'm putting a lot of supposition in there, and so he comes to this point, and he takes action based on what he truly believes is God's will. It's an interesting, now I don't have scriptural proof that he felt this way, because we're doing an awful lot of this discussion in the white spaces. Yeah. Which is the part that it doesn't tell us about. But I also don't see, other than Satan entering into him, a lot of indication that he might not have truly been convinced that he was going to help make the will of God take place. So where does this leave Judas? And I'm particularly talking about where the human agent makes a wrong or even a truly disastrous choice because he or she misunderstands the data or the situation. That's kind of something I'm wondering about Judas.
Well, let me ask you a quick question on that. How would you fit into the fact that John records that he was the treasurer and was stealing from the treasury all along?
Well, I don't know whether that's connected or not. I'm simply saying that Judas may have been convinced that this was the way to make the kingdom happen. I mean, there have been people who have had sticky fingers on one hand. Basically, people who have, shall we say, had good motivations in one area, but find themselves failures in another. I think we've seen enough people in the ministry, for example, who end up out due to scandals, and financial is not that uncommon. And you have to ask the question, does this mean that they never really cared about the mission or not? So I'm not sure that him being a thief says, he necessarily has to be a thorough scoundrel in all other ways.
Well, that's a very interesting point. And I think that when we look at Judas, in many ways, Judas is also every woman and every man who's, if we bring in the stealing from the treasury, I don't know anyone that isn't conflicted in some part of their lives. The Jungians might call it our shadow side, that what we're trying to avoid is also alluring to us. There probably is a part of each one of us. I mean, it goes down, again, I'm defined myself as being progressive, but I have a strong sense of imperfection and sin. And Judas may very well be one of these most conflicted creatures in history. What I wrestle with is this question you bring up, Henry, about trying to force God's kingdom. I still see people who are looking for the second coming of Jesus and are actually, the good news. The good news is that there's bad news. And there's a certain sense that maybe we can do something by our support of Israel unconditionally that will help usher in the kingdom quicker than having a different kind of policy. So I still think apocalyptic thinkers try to determine God's will more than perhaps they ought to.
And how much of a sin is trying to make God's kingdom happen on my schedule?
Well, that was one of Jesus' temptations, I think, was the temptation to make everything right, to use all that power. And in some sense, we have to trust that God's vision is much larger than ours, and God's timetable may be quite different than our own, even in our own personal lives, not to mention Earth history.
Well, don't you have this saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions?
It seems to be regularly occurring.
Yeah, nothing more dangerous than a person that wants to control your life with good motives.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that, I think, and everyone seems to want to do it at some part of their lives. It's the ambiguity of trying to do good things. There always tends to be unintended consequences, even of our best efforts, whether they be in the political system or in personal relationships.
Yeah. Well, we're at the half-hour mark, and I know Henry wanted to do a little advertising here, so let me turn this over to Henry real quick, and he can push a few books and make a shameless plug or two.
Well, it's a shameless plug because this program is sponsored by Energeon Publications, and I own Energeon Publications, and you're both authors. Even though I've decided to be a guest today, I do want to mention some books. We'll start with Dr. Bruce Epperly, who has been taking the lion's share here of the questions because we keep hitting him with them. I wanted to bring two of your books up.
I have an angel with me in the lion's den, so don't worry.
Let me hold up. This is one of Bruce's most recent, Ruth and Esther. I don't have on hand with me a copy of his most recent, From Here to Eternity, which is preparing for the next adventure. You'll notice the word adventure occurs a lot in Bruce's writing, and I think that's a good thing. It's one of the things I enjoy the most about it. This is in our Topical Line Drive series, so just $5.99. And this is probably the nastiest challenge I ever gave to an author was when I asked Bruce, could he write a 44-page book on process theology? Now, if anybody has read other books on process theology, you'll probably understand how difficult of a task that was.
And I think it has the Guinness Book of Records for the shortest book on process thought.
Probably it does. I will point out, and I don't think even Bruce knows this yet, that both Ruth and Esther and From Here to Eternity are now available both on Kindle and on iTunes for iBooks and on Google Play. e-books. They're available on all three of those outlets. So that just happened in the last couple of days. They're available in all of those outlets. I'll turn to Elgin, but unfortunately, Elgin, I really didn't get in this pile of books any of your books, and they are lost where I'd have to walk away to get them.
All sold out, huh?
That is a really sad thing.
Bestsellers, they're just flying off the shelf.
Well, let's see. I think I got a copy here.
Elgin, show us the book, please.
Talk, Elgin.
This is Christianity and Secularism. It's the second book that I wrote. And let's see, do I have something else here? I was actually doing some research for Friday's Global Christian Perspectives. And I also have Preserving Democracy.
Okay. Well, and while you're at that, and you have What is Wrong with Social Justice, which is the one I really intended to have in the stack of books over here, but it isn't there. Elgin, speaking of that, he appears on our Friday show, Global Christian Perspectives, as co-host. I like to say that we have Elgin from the right side of the political spectrum and the left side of the pond. And Chris Eyre, who's an Energeon associate editor, he comes from the right side of the pond and the left side of the political spectrum. And they host and get a couple of guests and go at it on current world events. Chris and Elgin can get pretty pointed in a friendly sort of way.
Well, and that's really what we need in our society. If I might take a little parenthetical here, our problem is not diversity. Our problem is lack of civility, and the ability of people to have strong opinions and remain friends and not go to character assassination because they disagree is really what democracy needs. The ideas need to be put out there, and I think, again, and I want to give you a plug, Henry. I actually think Energeon as a press, though it may be like Bethlehem and Judea, not the largest of presses, but Energeon is really putting out, and I think Elgin would agree with me, a variety of platforms of texts that virtually no other press is doing right now, and not liberal progressives like myself or more conservative people like Elgin both have a home there, and that's a good thing, I think.
And we haven't killed each other yet.
No, and we actually are better for it, I think.
Well, I really appreciate the conversations that we get out of this. I'm going to hold up one of my own books, which is Not Ashamed of the Gospel, Confessions of a Liberal Charismatic, just so that I can tell you about the subtitle. I was dubbed a liberal charismatic by somebody who truly didn't like me, and he didn't like liberals, and he didn't like charismatics. So
boy, you really got it deep there.
So he came up with the title for me. He says, you know, Henry, what you are is you are just a liberal charismatic, which put me kind of on the bottom of his pile. So I had written this book and was thinking about, going with it. And I mentioned to Jody, my wife, that this subtitle, and it was kind of as a joke, and she says, "Oh no, honey, that's you. That's absolutely you." So I thought, now I'm in trouble if my wife thinks the label attached by my worst enemy is really a good one. I went to one of my friends, a local pastor, and I said, I'm thinking about using this subtitle. He says, "Oh, that absolutely describes you."
Well, and I think we need to go beyond stereotypes in terms of the religious world and the political world alike. It's possible to be conservative in some areas and liberal in other areas politically or spiritually. It's possible to be a hawk and a social liberal, or a pacifist and more socially conservative. And I think the notion that there's one pathway theologically or politically is really undermines both politics and faith.
I actually wrote a post on the Energeon Discussion Network 2 weeks ago, or no, last week it came out on I call it do unto others, and it's how we should treat others as individuals. We have to use labels because we don't have the mind of God, and we can't treat all 7 billion people in the world as individuals, but we have to be very careful with how we use our labels, and more importantly, when we run into somebody, realize that they're not going to match our labels very well. They're going to be individuals.
We certainly hope so.
Let me bring this back to something that was mentioned just before the end of the bottom of the hour break, and go a little bit off base here a bit, but something you struck me, Henry, where you said that that Judas is a little bit of everybody in us. Everybody's a little bit of Judas. I thought that was kind of unique because if you've ever seen the movie Jesus Christ Superstar,
yes,
essentially what they did with the character of Judas in that is they put basically a modern 20th century mindset into Judas and had him ask the questions and basically represent us in the movie, which I always thought was kind of unique in the sense that because ultimately when we sin, we are the ones betraying Christ in many respects, yes, just as much as Judas betrayed him or as Peter denied him. Whenever we go off and sin, we are basically denying Christ or betraying Christ. So I thought that was kind of a unique way of portraying Jesus or Judas in that movie, and I thought it kind of related back to what you mentioned. Any reactions?
It allows us to have some sympathy for Judas, who's not a cardboard character. Going back to your comment about the stereotypes or trying to see people in one dimension, Judas may very well be a multi-dimensional character in the same way that Peter and Thomas are multi-dimensional characters. Oftentimes the disciples are portrayed as almost as the chorus. But Peter stands out because he's highly conflicted and is as faithful as you come, and also as courageous as you come, and also as frightened as you come. And Thomas is one who's honest about his doubts and honest and struggles, and yet stays with the community even though he doesn't get it. And Judas may not, in quotes, be the evil character in an unambiguous way. He may be ambiguously troubled throughout the whole process. And I think Jesus Christ Superstar, those questions, who are you? What are you about here? Are you the and it goes back to our comment about the messianic hope. Certainly the passion stories point out the fact that Jesus was not your stereotypical messianic leader. He comes into town on a colt or a donkey and not a war horse. Mm-hmm. And that could be very disappointing to somebody who wants the systems changed right now.
Well, don't we oftentimes take people who we consider bad for whatever reason on the extreme, whether it be the Nazis or whether it be Judas or whether it be a murderer, and we almost make them into cartoon characters that are so one-dimensionally evil, and I think we do that because it makes us feel better. We're not them. And the more evil we can make them, the less evil we become. But going back to what Viktor Frankl said, one of the things I thought was most important in his book, Man in Search of Meaning, was when he said, there are only two races of people. There are the decent and the indecent, and they can be found among all groups.
Yes. And I think that's an important nuance for people of faith who recognize our own fallibility as well as the possibility that the other may have good qualities too. So it's possible to be a liberal charismatic, for example. And that actually, to me, would be a positive. You don't need to be one of God's frozen chosen, as oftentimes more liberal Christians tend to be in their worship. You can be an exciting, and lively, and also hold, a liberal theology. I mean, I think occasionally I baffle people because I am interested in the healings of Jesus and will pray for somebody at the drop of the hat. Do a lot of prayers over the telephone. You know, I'm talking to somebody and they're sharing something. Say, would you like a prayer? And I take seriously the healing ministry of Jesus, but you could say, but this guy is pretty progressive theologically. That doesn't fit. But yet, we can be legion in the best sense of the word. And I always remember, you sort of inspired me, Elgin, to remember something of Reinhold Niebuhr. I need to be cognizant, I'm giving a paraphrase, of my truth, the truth in my neighbor's falsehood, and the falsehood in my own truth.
Yeah. It's not black and white at all in many situations. So, Henry, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I'm going to bring in a user question. Do I not want God to answer my prayers definitively? I want him to destroy cancer. I want him to not just send me bread for today, but the Publishers Clearinghouse money.
Well, yes. I think that all of us want that. I mean, I want to, and in addition to that, we may be like Augustine and pray for chastity, but not today. But, you know, we want to have
the movie. Go back to another movie. You got the movie, Bruce Almighty, where he decides to answer everybody's prayer and let them win the lottery, so everyone wins $1.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the case that that's one of the drawbacks of the prosperity gospel, because it really does want to give us what really sees God as a genie. Now, yeah. I think it's possible that we may be the answer to other people's prayers, and other people may be the answer to our prayers. So I think it's okay for your caller, Henry, to pray boldly. Jesus, in fact, suggests that we do. I mean, I pray for people that the cancer be turned around, even though it looks unlikely. I've not prayed for the Publishers Clearinghouse. Occasionally I've prayed for enough money to pay the bills this month. I'm a guy whose water heater just died today, so I'm working on water heater prayers. But you know, I think that we, you know, you're right on target. And of course, Bruce Almighty is a nickname people have given me, and it's not quite worked yet. But I might be the guy who gets $1. But yeah, we want the lottery ticket, but Jesus never promises that we'll have always a clear road ahead. But he promises the abundant life, but abundant life may be exactly what, may be very different than we imagine.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elgin.
I was just going to say, and actually the studies are pretty clear, the vast majority of people who win the lottery end up far worse off within a couple of years.
It is an interesting thing, and actually to add to that, another group of studies about the happiness thing that suggests that the optimal amount of yearly income for happiness is about $75,000 to $100,000. And after that, it really doesn't necessarily increase people's happiness. People are just looking, I think, and this is hopefully for looking for an economic system that provides the best possibilities for everyone. But if people don't have to worry and they get basics taken care of, that's in many ways what brings happiness.
Well, bringing this back to our initial discussion in terms of determination and choice, isn't our wish for money in many respects a wish to be free from, you know, having to make choices we don't really want to make?
Yeah, I think it is. And of course, you know, the philosopher Whitehead, sort of the parent of process theology, says that within the limitations, though, there are great opportunities. And so if I could have all my wishes, I wouldn't have any possibilities anymore. And another term for limitation is concreteness. You know, I would love to win Publishers Clearinghouse, and who knows, I'm not going to oppose it. But having said that, I think that out of our limits, again going back to suffering, out of our limits we create a life. You know, we have this marriage and not another. We live in this town and not another. Jesus is in Galilee and not in India. and that makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
There's two
I
things.
actually remember another study on income that basically surveyed people across the spectrum and asked them how much money would you need to be happy. And the interesting thing was it didn't really make any difference what they made. The answer was pretty much the same, about 20%. You could just make 20% more of what they had did at that point, then they would think they would be happy. And yet, no matter how much they make, they're always going to want that additional 20%.
Well, yeah, that's part of the desire of life. Yes.
Yeah, I was interested. I find Hebrews 5, the early verses, interesting, where it says that Jesus prayed to, and it's referring to the garden prayer, prayed to be released, and he was heard. And yet, of course, the interesting thing is that the cup was not taken away from him in that case. So you have the explicit prayer for what you want there, but you also have the surrender to the better will. Before I pass this on, I've got another audience question here to bring in. And that is, I've just selected it. For those of you following on Google+, you can go to the question, and while it's selected, it'll show you right where it's being answered. And this goes back to Judas. So is Judas in heaven? Was he forgiven?
That's an interesting question, and I obviously can't intuit God's full thoughts. That's, as President Obama said about a question at one point in time, that's above my pay grade. But at the same time, you wonder about that, because Jesus does forgive those who crucify him. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Was Judas any more culpable, and none of us can really discern that, than Pilate, than Caiaphas, than the soldier soldiers who put him on the cross, than Peter, who denied him 3 times, than the other male disciples who ran to the hills, but for the disciple Jesus loved? It's a good question. I think that probably at the end of the day, there's some medieval paintings and stories in which Judas is invited back to the Last Supper, and that there's a place kept for him there. I believe that forgiveness is possible for everyone.
I think probably the reason for many people that they feel that Judas cannot possibly be in heaven, and many people do, is probably they feel that him hanging himself, that a suicide was the final seal. Now, I don't agree with that myself, but I think that God's grace is sufficient for things that we don't really imagine. But nonetheless, I think that's probably the reason that so many feel that there is no redemption. Peter could come back, John 21, and say, yes, I love you. Doubting Thomas could eventually stick his finger in the side and so on. He could acknowledge, but Judas didn't have that particular opportunity, and for many of us, I wonder if that's not a kind of, in our own minds, a symbol for our own fear that we're going to end up with the wrong choice and not having the opportunity to fix it.
I think that's a wonderful idea, because it's a little bit like the country western song, and somebody's going to have to remind me who the singer is. Live every day as if you're dying. Every day I suspect I make a few bad choices. Then most of them are socially acceptable bad choices. I'm not going to be indicted for them. I'm just going to say I messed up, but it's not a big mess up. You know what I'm talking about? Yep. The sins of good people. But sometimes I ask myself, when I'm in just really getting upset about something, if I drop dead at this moment, would I like this to be the last thing that's there? And that's an interesting thing to ponder. What would your legacy if you yelled at your wife or got impatient with a grandchild and then you drop dead, that'd be a terrible thing. So at one level, it's been an interesting sort of protection for me. I keep asking myself, would this be my best last act? And of course, I go ahead and do some things I don't need to do nevertheless. But it's a way of saying, I better pay attention to what I think is best in the moment. I guess with Judas, the other thing that I ponder, and this is for obviously another conversation and a longer one, I don't believe death is an impediment to God. I don't believe God's attitude changes immediately at the hour of our death. I think that God is still infinite in God's grace and may keep offering the gifts of salvation until the time we say yes.
Yeah, I would argue probably the opposite side, particularly since as the verse I read where it talked about it'd be better if he had never been born, and,
Sure.
and how terrible it was for him. I think that more than the suicide, although it's not that I think suicide is such a horrendous sin that it can't be forgiven because you're dead. I think it's more. I think it's within the nature of sin. Sin is rebellion against God, and I think at some point the rebellion becomes so part of the person that the person can no longer be reconciled. You could say the same thing. Could Hitler have been saved?
Yeah.
Right? I don't think it would have been possible. Not because it's beyond God's ability to forgive. I think it's beyond a person's. When you descend into the darkness so deep, at some point you lose yourself in the darkness and can no longer come out. And so I would think that's probably more where, you talk about the guards or pilot or somebody like that. They didn't spend 3 years in intimate relationships day by day, sleeping nearby, eating, working together with Jesus, seeing his miracles, seeing what he did, hearing his teaching in the same way that Judas did. So I think
I hear you entirely there on that. I take a different path, but I think yours is, Elgin, is a position that can be defended. Even though it's not my own position, I think it's quite defensible. I think evil has to be taken seriously, and the consequences of evil. I happen to be inclined toward being a universalist, but I think being inclined toward being a universalist doesn't mean that at the hour of the death we suddenly become an angel. We still have some stuff we have to deal with. And that maybe that's back to the question of karma again that you brought up earlier on. Even those in heaven have to deal with their lives and to deal with our sins of commission and omission over time.
I heard your position once described as hopeful universalism.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. But, some people would say that a good definition of hell is to be hearing the gospel message over and over and not believing it. And at that moment when we finally say yes to grace, then the gospel becomes a glorious story, and even the least of greatest of sinners finds their way home. And but God is persistent. But I recognize that there are other ways of looking at it.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in something that was in our notes here because of what we just said. Is what is the unpardonable sin? Because I really can answer that in, give you my answer, not answer the question, but my answer is it's the one that you don't want to be pardoned of. To me,
I think that's a wise one. I've struggled with that, and when Jody sent that email that had that on there, I went back and looked at a number of commentaries. I read pretty broadly, and most of the liberals or progressives don't even talk about that. So I get my best thinking on this from more evangelical people, and there's no consensus, at least what on earth we're talking about. The sense, I think in many ways, I don't know that there is an unpardonable sin, but I do know that there are behaviors that certainly take us far out into the darkness and far away from God's vision for our lives. And each one of us has those moments. It may be the peccadillo, the little small sin that keeps us from being who God calls it to be. It may be socially acceptable. It may be the minister who is devoting his life to God, but their family life is a shamble because they've forgotten that God also wants you to be a good parent too and a good spouse. So I'm not sure how to answer that one, Henry. That may be above our pay grade too.
For me, in context, because it occurs in a particular historical
Yes.
context, which is the Pharisees had just accused Jesus of performing miracles through the agency of Satan.
Yes.
And I think it's sort of going back a little bit to what Judas did, was to be confronted with God incarnate working through the power of God, and to call that Satan requires a level of cynicism and darkness that that I think follows under the unpardonable sin, which, although for me, I have to, in all honesty, admit there's a bit of I'm not sure how to say it, relief in the sense that can no longer happen, since none of us are in that position or can be in that position. You had to be in the very presence of Jesus. I don't know if it goes beyond that, but I know that's in the historical context, that seemed to be what was actually called the unpardonable sin.
Yep. Sin against the Spirit.
I think it has to do with cutting yourself off from listening, but I use quite a few different things, and that's one of the things is, the more brightly the light shines and you go ahead and call it darkness, the more you're closing yourself off to being able to hear or to being able to see. You have a loud and a clear presentation, and you just keep saying no. And it can be, I think, like Bruce said, just the little things that you just repeatedly, but to me, unpardonable is something that we might do to ourselves in that sense. And I'm not trying to argue the God acting beyond death situation. I'm just saying that, we can't. It seems to me that we can turn off our own hearing. It's not that God sits there and goes, okay, here's the line, I'm done with you. To me, I think it's God keeps talking. Do we keep listening?
Sort of like C.S. Lewis's version of hell, where people just keep moving themselves further and further away from God and isolating themselves more and more, that they're free to leave, but they don't want to.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, is a really excellent and thought-provoking little book on that topic.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of the hour. I want to thank you again. We've been talking to Dr. Bruce Epperly and Henry Neufeld. And any final comments before we shut down?
Well, it's a joy to be in conversation one more time and to talk substantively and to share positions uniquely our own and to have different perspectives and do it in a creative and civil fashion. I think this series is a model for civil conversation in the religious world and, of course, in the world beyond us, too.
Well, I really appreciate Elgin coming in and being the host so that I could be more talkative and, some of my own ideas as opposed to just asking the questions. So, Elgin, I appreciate your help this evening, especially. It was a good conversation.
You're welcome.
God bless.
Okay, with that, we'll see everybody, I hope, next Tuesday night, and here we go.